now you go from 145% when you're importing from China down to 30%. And I think, we can say it's good news, but we can't get too far away from the doom and gloom because 30% is still a lot.
The 145% tariffs, it wasn't sustainable, was it? And we heard from Xeneta customers and, in the kind of media at large and in the industry that they were basically putting their foot on the ball and stopping shipments, weren't they?
In the week leading up to it, we were hearing more and more rumours and more expectations that the tariffs would come down. There was a recognition that 145% was just too high. Welcome to the Freight Debate, the ultimate destination for supply chain professionals, logistics leaders, and anyone who's ever wondered what really keeps the world moving. Phil, you're joining me again today. Let's start off. We did sort of promise good news last time, and I think we can. It's probably not us that's delivered it, but it's certainly come.
It has. We were full of doom and gloom in the last episode for those that listened to it, but we did promise good news, and good news we shall deliver. So you're right, we don't have a hotline into the White House, but maybe we can take some credit for the events of the past week. So Emily, as senior shipping analyst, can you give us a bit of a rundown, firstly, of the piece of good news announced last week around the U.S. China tariffs, the lowering of the tariffs?
I think that's also the one that has most impact on container shipping now, right? That compared to some of the other things, if we just list them, we had obviously the ceasefire in between the U.S. and the Houthis that kind of re-sparked the debate about the Red Sea. We then had the U.K.-U.S. trade deal, which is the first of those kind of deals since Liberation Day. And then lastly, the big one for container shipping these days is the rolling back or the pausing of some of those tariffs from on imports from China to the U.S. and then also the other way around. So that now you go from 145% when you're importing from China down to just 30%. And I think, we can say it's good news, but we can't get too far away from the doom and gloom because 30% is still a lot. It may not mean that nothing happens and stuff will go. We're hearing from a lot of places about a bump in cargo out of China towards the US, but it's still a substantial cost increase, and we can't lose sight of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a bit of a surprise, wasn't it? I mean, what was it a surprise? Because the 145% tariffs, it wasn't sustainable, was it? And we heard from Xeneta customers and, in the kind of media at large and in the industry that they were basically putting their foot on the ball and stopping shipments, weren't they? And that's not a sustainable position for global trade or individual businesses. So I suppose at some point something had to give, didn't it? But that being said, we didn't know when or in what way. So I suppose it is still a shock to the kind of global supply chain system, isn't it? The way it's happened.
Yeah, I think in the week leading up to it, we were hearing more and more rumours and more expectations that the tariffs would come down. Obviously not to what level they would come down. And that was, we were hearing about it. More shippers were looking to bonded warehouses in the hopes that get the goods in and then they can react quickly should those tariffs drop. Same thing a little bit with routing some stuff through Canada and then having it at the border so you can react quickly. So there was that kind of feeling in the industry, I think, that there was a recognition that 145% was just too high. But I think it took me a little bit by surprise that we went all the way down. 30% is still high, but that it was such a quick cut. Now, of course, it's for 90 days, and there's a whole lot of uncertainty about what happens after that. But certainly you see an uptick in demand. I think Hapag-Lloyd came with their Q1 results, and in that briefing they were saying a 50% increase in bookings out of China. Obviously from a low level, but that's still a substantial increase, and we'd expect that to kind of continue for the next 90 days until that pause at the moment ends.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to stop the good news and kind of revert to Mr. Doom and Gloom with a rain cloud over my head again. But it's probably worth mentioning, isn't it, that when we say tariffs have fallen from 145% down to 30%, and you're saying that 30% is still a lot, that's very true. But it isn't just 30%, is it? Because the 30% is on top of all of the other tariffs that have been levied and introduced, whether it's during Trump's first presidency and subsequently during Biden's term in office. So it's more than 30%, isn't it? I think there's maybe a bit of a misapprehension out there through people who aren't specifically involved in the procurement circles, that it's, you know, if you ship something that's $100, you pay, there was a $30 levy. It's not true, is it? It's $30.
So it'll be true for some goods, and I think that's when we look at the tariffs this time around. They are in this 30%, they're blanket tariffs. Of course, we still have the 25% steel, aluminium, and the existing tariffs, they were much more based on the good. There was some background gone into what tariffs face what goods, whether it was Trump or it was Biden. So certain product categories are still facing much higher tariffs than that. But of course, if you're adding a tariff on top of the existing tariffs, you'd prefer that to be 30% than 145%. And just to say, on the other side, the Chinese have lowered theirs to, I think, 10%.
Yeah.
Which is also still substantial, especially when you look at what goods typically are exported, and a lot of that is agricultural goods, and there again the margins are tighter than they would be on some other commercial products. So again, good news, but it's still a barrier to the sort of easy trade that you'd be looking for.
Yeah. So I mean, that's probably the best way, isn't it? It's a hurdle. Before, the 145 essentially killed trade, didn't it, for a lot of goods and a lot of businesses. The 30% just means it's a hurdle for them to get over, rather than, you know, pulling up the drawbridge completely. So let's assume that some businesses can get over that hurdle and the 30% is kind of manageable. What's the consequences? What are we going to see in the next few weeks?
I think we've referred back to the pandemic comparisons to when you had that significant drop out of China in the first months of 2020. And we were saying we don't expect the next step to happen again, which was a kind of boom in demand. And that was driven by increased demand out of the US, more consumer demand. I think we've got the next 90 days where we'll see higher exports, because I think you still are running on the assumption that you don't know what is coming in 90 days' time. The reality is, it's a slightly earlier peak season than it would otherwise have been, but I would certainly expect that in 90 days' time, and there's two windows, right? There's the window of 60 days for everybody other than China, and then there's still 90 days for China. So you've kind of got the first window now for 2 months, where in theory you have higher exports from everywhere, and then that ends, and you still got 30 days with higher imports from China, and that will drive up spot rates. It will drive up the utilization. We're seeing carriers kind of reinstating some of the services they blanked. We're seeing increasing sort of port times and congestion in China as well, as that kind of builds up, and ships need to be repositioned because carriers reposition them initially to one thing and they have to move around, and all of that is inefficient. But I think we will see an upwards pressure definitely on spot rates for those 90 days. And then a little bit, regardless what happens with tariffs come August, that demand has been brought in. So even if tariffs were best case scenario dropped to zero, you're not going to keep importing those goods, because you have what you need for certainly through the Christmas period. You've got those, and you don't have unlimited space for keeping your goods.
Yeah, maybe I'm going to come across as bashing carriers a little bit today, but when we talk about capacity, and you know the fact that freight rates are probably going to increase in the next few weeks because of the increase in volume and, you know, squeeze on capacity. Yeah, but capacity is only being squeezed because the carriers slash capacity on those U.S. China trades because of the fall in demand during the kind of when the higher 145% tariffs were in place. So if you're a shipper, would you say, well, hang on a minute, you know, you're saying there's a squeeze on capacity, but is it a self-inflicted squeeze on capacity from the carriers? And I'll let you answer that one, Emily.
Thank you. I think it's not entirely unreasonable. I think that argument was probably better made when they were announcing capacity reductions, and you were saying, listen, the capacity's there, you're artificially reducing it, and what happened? Rates kept flat. And that's where I think carriers were actually going in to change the dynamic. I think now all the carriers can see this is going to cease for higher spot rates. They want all the containers they can get in that market. So yes, there's going to be a delay because the ships have moved. We talked about, I think previously, record high capacity into Europe. there are ships that were meant to be going to the US that have already left for Europe. That doesn't just miraculously appear in China because there's containers to be moved. So I think for now, it's fair enough for carriers to say, listen, we are reacting as quickly as we can. And we are in a situation where we can see how this makes us money for at least 3 months. They're going to want to, benefit from that. And artificially keeping capacity out is not in their best interest at the moment. Sure. I think your argument might have more weight again on the flip side, when presumably lower demand means they'll start adjusting capacity, and then you can discuss it. But I think in this situation, it's probably not fair.
Yeah, and we'll probably go on to it later, but they certainly do need to make money while they still can, don't they, right now?
That's for sure. That's for sure.
That's the short term. Then immediate term, kind of, front loading, lack of or squeeze on capacity rather than lack of capacity, as we just articulated. So squeeze on capacity, freight rates likely increasing on those Transpac trades.
And the rest of the world, because you can say a Transpac trade, but again, something that happens in one place will happen and will have effects on the rest of the world. Those ships that were providing record capacity into Europe, they go back to the US, then there's suddenly a capacity squeeze into Europe and many of the other smaller secondary trades. So yes, in theory, it's only important for US importers, but the reality is everything has an effect on everything else.
Yeah. Okay, that's short term. We're going to have the freight rates increasing probably quite considerably, north of 20%, probably, but significant. We know that, don't we?
We've discussed during the first trade war, and rates were at a different level, but there they had this window to import goods, and spot rates went up by 70%. So I think there is a substantial potential there for rates to increase.
Yeah, and I suppose it depends how much they've front-loaded already because of all the other threats and what inventories they've got left. And actually, for a lot of businesses, what's their margin on those goods? Is 30%? How high is that 30% barrier when you've got you're shipping a good with quite a low margin? Each business is going to react to this in a very different way, aren't they?
Yeah, and if your goods can be moved months in advance and you have the warehouse, it's not possible for everybody. Sure. So we can say sort of we're seeing those 50% increase that Hapag is reporting, but it is not everybody that can do this front loading, even if they wanted to. And that is also something to bear in mind, that there are still some companies that are sitting there thinking, I can't produce my goods 3 months in advance and hope that they're still relevant for Christmas. You need to be more fast paced on that.
Sure. Okay.
I know you want to get to the long term.
I do. I'm trying my best here to move you on from the immediate. I'm trying to get to the kind of I'm trying to get back to the good news. You keep pulling me back to the bad news of escalating freight rates for shippers. So good news is the good news in the longer term for shippers in terms of how these freight rates are going to develop once we get past this initial kind of chaos.
I would say if you're looking at it, if you're looking as a shipper and looking purely at what happens to your freight spend, then yes. But that's also in part because the rest of your business is suffering consequences from whatever happens. So a shipper logging into Xeneta will say, okay, great, I can procure freight for less. But the rest of the team might be saying, actually, we're still in a big trouble. But yeah, we would certainly expect freight rates to fall. At some stage, demolition has to rise. The idle fleet has to rise because at the end of the day, yes, we still have the Red Sea, and we'll get to that as well, but the capacity is there. And at some stage, carriers will return and start seeing those rates that they were getting in Q4 2023 when some of them started losing money. And if we do see that substantial decrease in demand that we would expect after this 90-day period, then even with the Red Sea, there's going to be significant downward pressure on rates.
Yeah, and then that's it from a rate perspective, that kind of good news for shippers, not for carriers. But from a learnings point of view, this is another kind of major supply chain shock after numerous ones previously. Shippers are going to kind of say, what can we do better? What have we done well during this one? They'll be having those kind of internal reviews, won't they? So what have shippers been doing? How have shippers reacted to tariffs? And I know there's lots of different strategies out there, but what have we been hearing from Xeneta customers in terms of, them trying to somehow mitigate some of the impact of these tariffs while they're in place at the higher level?
To a certain extent, it's a lot about combining data sets to understand what's going on. If you're importing from a particular place and the transit time is substantially different between the East Coast and West Coast, maybe you usually go through the East Coast, but suddenly you say, okay, it takes so and so many days for my ship it. I can actually get it to the US quicker if I go through the West Coast. Then obviously I have to find a way to get it across the country. But I have a window where actually going to the East Coast is too slow to get there, and you'll get there when the tariffs are implemented, whereas you can get quicker to the West Coast and get there beforehand. Or, I mean, looking to air freight, if you have a 1-day window where you can bring goods in, then maybe you say, okay, looking at the total landed cost, of course it's going to cost me a lot more money to air freight it, but if I save on those tariffs because I missed them with 6 hours, then that's worth it. But it's about having that data, understanding your positioning, understanding your suppliers, and understand what your carriers can offer, because not everybody can just say, I want my stuff moved. Of course, some of the bigger shippers can, that are shippers of choice for carriers, but it's not an option for everybody.
Yeah, and I suppose it doesn't even need to be anything as dramatic as switching from the East Coast to the West Coast. I presume that it could be something, when we're talking days and sometimes hours count when you're trying to beat these tariffs, you could drop off your boxes in New York rather than waiting for that string of port calls down further down the East Coast, whether it's Virginia or whatever. That could save you a day, and actually that one day could save you hundreds of thousands of dollars, couldn't it?
Absolutely. And why wouldn't you do that if you can?
Yeah.
Yes, you then have an issue of getting it from New York, but if you're front loading these goods, you don't need them immediately. As long as they're in the US, okay, we can figure that out from there. So everybody's looking at what they have available to them.
Yeah, and I mean, shippers are going to be looking at this, aren't they? And looking, talking to each other. And we hold round tables, don't we, where shippers actually discuss between themselves how they've responded to this. One example was a manufacturer of leisure equipment who have production facilities in China, and they have production facilities in Vietnam. Now, what they were able to do and react really decisively when the tariffs came into effect and there were higher tariffs from China was actually send products made in China into Europe and Australia rather than the US, where they ordinarily would have gone, and the products that they were producing in Vietnam, where the lower tariffs, they were sending into the US, when actually they would have ordinarily been sending them into Europe and Australia. So, it's about having that flexibility and diversification in your supply chains. Now, again, not all businesses can do that,
because even that, and even businesses who can do that, that's great. But the tariffs on imports from Vietnam, more than this 10%, they're 2 months away now. So it's great in this 60-day period if you can do that, and obviously a month has already passed. But even if you have that option, and not everybody has that option, you're still looking into a huge amount of uncertainty as to what happens for imports from Vietnam in 2 months' time.
I agree, and this is why in the future it's going to be so difficult for shippers, isn't it? The days of them just kind of having a tried and tested manufacturing setup and supply chain route into the same port over and over. I mean, are those days gone? Procurement teams are going to have to be looking at, almost playing 3D chess here, aren't they? It's going to be
where the rules keep changing.
So it's going to be really difficult. But I suppose that scenario planning, if they can bring that diversification into their supply chains, we know there's going to be another major incident or geopolitical event in future. So maybe this is the time that they're going to be holding those internal reviews to say, what can we do? What can we actually do to provide some resilience in our supply chains?
Absolutely, and it all ends in the question of, and it kind of leads us on perhaps to the other piece of good news, which was this UK-US trade deal. But before we get quite there, what is the goal of these tariffs? Is it to get manufacturing back to the US? Okay, but if you're pausing and putting on these tariffs, and we're hearing now, I guess we're recording this on a Friday, so who knows what the case will be on come Monday, but of talks that actually the US has said we can't deal with every single country, so we'll be writing to these countries with a tariff level, but they've just decided. To me, that sounds a lot like Liberation Day, but just doing it over a few weeks instead. And there may well be another magical formula that appears, and just dictates what's happening.
Do you believe them?
No comment.
Does it sound like someone who's not received any Valentine's cards saying they don't have time to go on a date.
I'll leave you with that and an insight into Phil's personal life. But I think yeah, exactly. How are you planning for this? Are you planning that it comes back to the tariffs we got on Liberation Day? Are you planning that there's going to be a deal and everything will be rosy come 2 months from now? There's no certainty at all.
Yeah.
And even if we take a look at this new US-UK deal, and I think as with many of the news we have these days, there's kind of one thing is announced here, something else is announced here, and something third is actually what seems to be applied in practice. But I think the UK is an interesting one to look at because it is one of the few countries that the US has a trade surplus with. So on Liberation Day, this formula didn't get them anywhere because there was no deficit. They still got this 10% tariff. So again, if your end goal is to reduce your trade deficit, then you shouldn't really be tariffing those countries you have a trade surplus with. But that's another matter. But that deal there, and there's a lot of intent, and we're going to look into this, and we're going to expand the deal, all the rest of it. But at the moment, that 10% is still in place. Yes, the steel and aluminium tariffs have gone down, so they're not facing that 25%. And then on the automobiles, I think it was 100,000 cars they can export at 10% instead of 25%. So yes, it's good. It's better than yesterday. But it's still not great. And if you've been, I mean, this UK-US trade deal has been talked about since, Brexit in 2016? If I was in the UK government, I wouldn't be too upset that this piece of news sort of got upstaged by a new pope within a few hours. Because yes, it's a good deal, but if you look at it in the details, it's not great. And if that's what we're looking at when it comes to all these other countries, or even if we say the US is negotiating with the 10 biggest ones and everybody else just gets a number that we've decided upon, you just don't know what to deal with. Yeah. And it just makes it really, really tricky, even if you're one of the first countries to get that trade deal. And I mean, our jobs is going to be a nightmare if every few days there's another deal and we have no idea where it came from, exactly how it's being implemented, when is it going to be expanded further, all these other question marks that arise from this.
Yeah, it's almost like business should be thankful for 30% or 10%, and, commercial environments are tough, aren't they? Dollars matter. So any business will feel the pain, no matter the big, small, or medium. These are real numbers that have real consequences. So yeah, really difficult time.
It's almost if there's some people on the other side that don't think these are real numbers with consequences. It's just let's pick one out of the hat today and see where that takes us.
Well, not put it.
You just can't
put them on the board. Put them on the board.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I think we've covered tariffs. For now, with some good news sprinkled with a bit of bad on top, I suppose. Let's move on to more good news, potentially sprinkled with a little bit of bad as well. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure we should maybe label it good news because we're talking about a conflict, aren't we? But when we're looking purely through the prism of freight rates and global shipping, we had the announcement of a ceasefire between the US and Houthi militia in Yemen. Again, could you just kind of lay the ground here for the discussion, because we talked about tariffs, but actually when we look at it when we look at the Red Sea, this is a much bigger issue purely from the freight rate perspective. Yeah,
this is one that is, I mean, it's basically the reason carriers were able to make money last year, to put it blankly, that this capacity is being absorbed. And of course, this news of a ceasefire is a good deal. But it comes back a little bit to what I said before. You get one thing announced here, another thing announced here, and then a statement saying a third thing. So I think, a lot of the major carriers were out immediately after saying, we're not fully sure what this deal is. I think the conclusion at the moment is that actually it's between the US and the Houthi militias. It doesn't cover any other ship. And as we've discussed in previous podcasts, there aren't many US-built container ships, so there's not many US container ships that are being saved, even if you truly believe that is what is holding, and they would be saved. So we kind of had a similar situation in January when there was this talk of this first ceasefire and these three-phase deals, and that did spur up a lot of talk about, okay, is it in 2 months' time that we can return and we go back to normal? It didn't happen. And I would say that seemed like a more solid basis to take decisions on than what we've got now. And as a carrier, there's all sorts of reasons why it's complicated to go back. They're very clear that going back, reshifting all of their networks will cause a lot of disruption. And you don't want to do that if you have to reverse a decision 2 weeks later. And that's totally fair. So from a carrier's perspective, they need something more to be able to make that return. And I don't really see where that's meant to be coming from if you consider the environment we're working in these days.
Yeah. So before I get letters of complaint from the CEOs of carriers, I'll let you answer this question. So you get letters of complaint from carrier CEOs.
How kind.
Yeah. Do they want to go back? Because at the moment, we had fallen demand, didn't we, from China to U.S, which was a kind of rate issue for carriers. That trend is going to continue eventually. If the Red Sea opens up as well, we're going to see rates collapse, aren't we? So for carriers, the longer they can carry on making money before that collapse, better. So they're not going to be held back, from going to the Red Sea, are they?
I think you can probably confirm the fact that I'm often quite cynical of carriers' behaviour, and yes, they have an interest in not going back. There is so much capacity that's being absorbed and helping them, but I don't think that's fair today. I don't think that's a fair complaint. There will come a time when there's slightly more, or a lot more security, a lot more sort of understanding of what's happening and what the plan is. And that's maybe when you can start having that conversation. But I think it's unfair at this moment to do it. And you can agree or disagree, but that's I'm no expert in geopolitics either. But
Sure.
That's how I see it at the moment.
Yeah. So let's just play a hypothetical scenario here. I mean, if I look at what the carriers have said, Maersk, too early to speculate about timing. Hapag-Lloyd will return when it's sufficiently safe to do so. MSC said they're going to continue to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope. Now, clearly, there's no imminent return for these carriers to the Red Sea. But let's play the game of there is. Let's say they're going to return in H2 at a large scale. What would be the impact of that?
Well, it would free up an awful lot of capacity as soon as you get past that initial congestion, because you would get congestion as those ships kind of arrive on North European ports in particular, double the numbers if you've kind of got those ships that are going around and then they're overtaken really by the first ships going through. But after that, once you've cleared that kind of congestion, you get a lot of ships that you suddenly don't really need anymore. And that's where we would certainly expect charter rates to fall, the idle fleet to rise, and carriers start looking to remove capacity, either by idling their ships or by demolishing them, right? We've had 5 years of very, very low demolition. There's a lot of old ships that would have been demolished under normal market conditions that are still sailing around. Carriers will do what they can to keep rates up, but the fundamental overcapacity in the fleet will hit once you get there.
Yeah, and again, I'm kind of setting you up for a bit of a kind of carrier predicament here. If rates do collapse, if the Red Sea opens up and we get the almost inevitable collapse in rates, in the absence of another black swan, be it a geopolitical tariff type thing, or a COVID or another war somewhere, whatever happens, which clearly is very likely. How low do rates need to go? And is it likely that rates could go so low that carriers find themselves in effectively a loss-making position for every box that they're moving on these trades?
I don't see why not. I mean, that's the reality of what we were seeing in Q4 2023. Not all of them, but a lot of those Q4 earnings were showing significantly lower margins, and so several carriers actually losing money on their average rate. So there's no reason why that wouldn't happen, especially when you say, okay, it also happens at a time when demand is decreasing because of all this front loading, regardless of what happens with tariffs. It kind of adds on top of each other in this time in the shipper's favor, and carriers looking to, well, can expect to lose money. And I think we saw that a little bit in the Q1 earnings, and that's even before, without a return to the Red Sea. If you look at their guidance for the full year, I mean, some of them had already made money in Q1 that was in the middle of their guided range. So they're perfectly feasible that they lose money the rest of the year. That's included. I doubt it, but I doubt it, especially now that we've got this 90-day from China, at least for the first half of the year. You should have enough to keep you going. But why wouldn't it come later down the road? And maybe why wouldn't it come is because they blank sailings, as they have done, as they did in the pandemic, as they did just in the past few months. But I think those, to a certain extent, was kind of temporary. I think there was an acceptance that, okay, at least for the tariffs in the rest of the world, we will move the capacity now and we'll see what happens. Certainly during the pandemic, this will last a few months. It becomes more structural if we talk about the overcapacity coming back from the Red Sea, and that's where carriers, I can't see them moving quite in the way like pack movement where they all go along the same lines. If you're really saying this is the new reality and this is what we'll be dealing with for the foreseeable future, then you're not going to keep blanking sailings in the hopes of keeping rates up. At least not everybody is. One of them will crack, and then presumably the rest will funnel like we have seen before.
Yeah, I mean, shippers have gone through, to say the very least, a difficult, challenging time in the past 18 months from, back in December 23 with Red Sea, and actually the Panama drought a couple of months before that.
Yep.
And then into the Red Sea, and then we've had port strikes, we've had the tariffs coming in. So a really difficult time. So they're not going to be shedding too many tears if carriers find themselves not making as much money as they have done during those major events. But at the same time, how do they approach tendering at the moment? Because time to market is going to be important. So, for example, we're going to see a short-term uptick in rates due to the kind of 90-day window if we get the front loading, but likely to then continue to fall. So if you're running an RFQ now, for example, it's very different to what it may be in a couple of months. But also, do they want, if you've referenced October 23 when carriers were heading towards that loss-making position, is that a good position for shippers? I mean, it's kind of, they want to have their goods shipped, don't they? And those shippers that did target the very bottom rate found themselves in a more difficult position when the Red Sea happened. So there's a lot. What I'm trying to say here is there's so many things in the mix, isn't there, for shippers to deal with: time to market, the delta between long and short-term rates. How do they approach that at the moment?
It's hard. Yeah. It is really hard because if your position is in the same place as we said Q4 2023, you were looking at, okay, the spread between long and spot was down, carriers were wanting your volumes, you're thinking, okay, after several years where I feel like I've been taken advantage of, now it's my turn, until it's not. And that's where we talk about having a partner and not going for that lowest rate, maybe looking at index-linked deals or having a renegotiation clause if you're signing up for a 12-month rate, all those kind of things that play in and give you a little bit more flexibility when it comes to reacting to the inevitable next thing, whatever that might be. But it's still very individual to you as a shipper, your profile, what trades you're on, what kind of margins does your goods have, all these kind of things that mean that for us, we can't say this is a strategy to go for, because there's simply not one for everybody.
Sure. And you referenced index-linked contracts there. For a lot of shippers, it makes total sense, doesn't it? That actually, you can strike whatever agreement you want at whatever rate you want, but if there is another Red Sea crisis, if there is another port strike,
or the Red Sea reopens, 2 months after you've signed your deal, because it can be positive and negative. Yeah.
So it's true, isn't it? And maybe we've been conditioned to going back to good news and bad news here, aren't we? We've been conditioned to bad news over the past 18 months. So when we talk about index-linked contracts, we talk about the index tracking an upward market. But you're absolutely right that from a shipper's point of view, if you lock into a rate now, that market is in the absence of another black swan event, your rate's going to track downwards, isn't it? So for a lot of shippers, that's going to be really attractive, isn't it?
Yeah, and less attractive to carriers, but that is a shift in the negotiating power and who calls the shots. And it's just a question of how far that goes. And a lot of that will depend on your trade. A lot of it will depend on the exact timing you go out, because that can make a huge difference these days.
Yeah, and I suppose a lot will depend on the strategy of the carriers, because we've just talked about different strategies for shippers and the fact that an index-linked contract might work for one shipper, might not work for another shipper. Some shippers might be able to flick a switch between manufactured in Vietnam or China. Actually, carriers will have different strategies as well, and particularly with the I don't know whether it's their tolerance of risk in the Red Sea, for example, or we've got the new alliances this year, haven't we? So I'm pretty sure that those alliances, even in a market where rates are falling, they're going to want to grab as much market share as they can, aren't they?
And it plays into all the other things also going on. I don't think we've mentioned the port fees yet, which is a first for us on this podcast.
This is good news only, this podcast. Port fees are bad news, so we're going to concentrate just on the good news.
Well, yeah, but if you're looking at it as an alliance, we've said, right, the Ocean Alliance is the one that's most exposed to these port fees, because it has COSCO, both a Chinese operator with a high number of ships built and ordered in China, and CMA is also one of the carriers most exposed to it when it comes to both of those. And the other thing those two carriers have in common is that they seem to be the ones least at risk in the Red Sea. CMA has one of its own services still running through there. I think it's relatively accepted that COSCO would face a lower risk. They haven't gone back. But if they're then looking at how do we minimize the cost of the port fees, they're going to be looking to their fleet and thinking, how do we move our ships around? And if they're suddenly tight on capacity and they're the two carriers that think, I'm probably safest through the Red Sea, that is a lever you would pull on.
Yeah.
And if one carrier starts doing that, then maybe the others feel pressured. But again, it all just fits into a much wider picture, and we have to wait and see a little bit how the alliances hold through these kind of significant disruptions that come almost every week these days.
Yeah. So we've just painted an incredibly complex picture, haven't we? So if you are tendering in the next 6-12 months, you have my deepest sympathy, because it's not going to be a straightforward task, is it? With all of these shifting parts. Okay, we've covered a hell of a lot of ground again, Emily. Put the world to rights again.
We've started off very positive. I think we kind of dampened it a little bit, but that's just us being realistic, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's true, isn't it? We joke about it, but you have to have balance in this, because there are so many considerations for shippers to factor in. Okay, what do we think for next week then? Are we gonna is the roll gonna continue? Do you think more good news? Who knows?
I think this new sort of whispers out of the US about finding a new number that a tariff is going to be one to watch, because it's going to have a huge impact on shippers importing to the US, and we don't know what is going on over there really. So that one's the big one to watch. Whether it turns out to be good news or bad, that I refuse to place a bet on.
Yeah, well, that's a good trailer for the next episode, isn't it? So thank you, Emily. We've covered tariffs and the quite dramatic events of the past week or so with the lowering of the tariffs between the US and China, and hopefully we've provided some valuable insight for listeners and viewers as to how many businesses are reacting now and how they may react in the future. And also clearly the Red Sea, even though it's not maybe an imminent factor, it's clear, isn't it, that at some point this is going to come home and going to be something that is going to rock the market to its core.
It's going to keep rocking it.
So yeah, we will no doubt to be continued with those two factors. So thank you, Emily, and thanks everyone for listening to the latest episode of The Freight Debate. We'll have much more insight in the next episode, so hit subscribe, join the debate, and let's keep the industry moving forward together. See you on the next one.